Hi Dr. Core, it's K Martorelli. I'm here to do my presentation on my LASA 1 about state funding in Arizona, Connecticut, and Oregon. Okay. All right. As I began my research, I realized that I actually had quite a bit of preconceived ideas about higher education funding in these three states. Living in Arizona and being a native here, attending higher education institutions here, and working in the K-12 setting, I thought I really had a great understanding of what was going on here and how it really related to the other states in our nation. Having relatives that live both in Connecticut and Oregon, I realized that I had really truly believed that both states funded education in all levels, both in preschool, elementary, high school, and in higher ed at a much higher rate than we did here in Arizona. And my initial research showed some of that. It did show that in Arizona, we fund $1,147 less than the national average in per pupil funding, which I was not surprised. And in Connecticut, we do fund there at $923 more than the national average. So this kind of backed up my initial thought. However, when I got to Oregon, I realized that they fund $2,230 less than the national average, and that they're actually 47th in the nation, which puts them further behind than we are in higher education per pupil funding. So I realized that I did need to look at some additional information. And what I initially found as I started digging further is that there were some commonalities among the three states. We all do base our funding on a per pupil model. It might look slightly different and the formulas may be a little bit different, but it does all get based on that per pupil funding. One of the more extensive formulas that's being used right now is in Oregon, ironically. The resource allocation model, or RAM, that they have put into place is looking at two key pieces. That first key piece is the per student full-time enrollment basis. It's a cell matrix, very similar to what we do here. It's based on just truly the attendance in those seats. But they have put in place a second piece here, which is really focused on their special initiatives. So they now have a targeted program basis as well, besides just that per full-time enrolled student basis. Some of our critical issues were similar as well. As we looked at all three states, I saw an obvious impact from that economic downturn. I know that we've had extensive conversations about the impact of higher education in Arizona based on the economy. One of the things I didn't realize also happened in Oregon is they were impacted by that sudden decrease of growth. So they had been one of the number one, or if not the number one, growing higher education institution group as their population was just really skyrocketing. And then when it hit in that 2008 era, when it started to turn around, they really drastically felt that impact where their enrollment really was not growing anymore, and they had that huge impact on their economic turndown because of it. We've also saw a trend across all of the states, more so in some than others, but still conversation focusing around that fading support for public education. I know here in Arizona we've had lots of media articles on it, and actually on a national station on MSNBC, our union representative and some of our supportive House of Representatives and senators were actually speaking about the blatant outward comments against public education and the funding of it from some of our candidates for office. So this is becoming an issue in some states, really are having an impact on their funding because of it. Looking at all of our states are also looking at competition right now. That it's definitely a market where students are looking for lower tuition and more of an immediate impact, especially in the job market. In Connecticut, they're feeling this especially because there are so many institutes for higher education available to students there, both in the private and the public sector. So they're really having to make sure that they have a very strong foundation of an education, but also a cheap tuition for them to be able to participate in. And then many of the institutions across the nation are facing the challenge of what performance-based funding will look like in current times. I know here in Arizona we're looking at that in particular, knowing that Governor Brewer has implemented that in her latest budget, but also knowing that she's on her way out. We will see what happens with that. Those similar kinds of uncertainties also exist across all of the states with it being an election year, and many of the issues in higher ed funding as well as pre-K through 12 funding have become so political that there's a lot of unrest and unease because of those uncertainties related to the election. So those are also some large issues that all states are facing regarding their funding in higher ed. So looking at federal trends to see how they line up with state trends, one of the largest trends that stuck out to me to begin with is that there's the financial aid woes. So really we're hoping that because of the lack of state funding and those allocations that we can make up that funds in the means of tuition, which means we really have to look at financial aid. Unfortunately, those higher tuition costs are not really giving us those high paying jobs. So with less jobs and less likelihood of achieving one of those high paying jobs that can pay those financial aid bills, there's a lot of hesitation to take those out. So as some students are looking at grants and scholarships, they're finding that there's a limited availability of those and that they're very competitive to get any of the ones that are really of substantial grant or scholarship. And this seems to be a trend right now with federal funding. I know with even the preschool through 12th grade world in elementary and high schools, we've been looking at a lot of frustration around the fact that the federal government isn't simply handing out the additional needed funds, but yet making them available through those competitive grants and things like Race to the Top and the preschool grants being very competitive and limited to certain states. So really that federal opportunity to support where the states are falling down is not really being seen either. So here are my references that I did use to look at and compare Oregon, Arizona, and Connecticut and their per pupil funding and their availability of revenue and expenditures and how they spend those were also very interesting. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to present this way. Have a great night.